Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Woolsey. I'm a member of the Guild of International Battlefield Guides, which is an organization designed to promote and train guides and maintain the code of conduct and standards. And I happen to specialize in First and Second World War Canadian battlefields. And tonight we're going to be talking about a battle that's actually a personal connection to me, which is the Battle of Courcelette. My great-grandfather fought in this action in 1916, so it's got a very personal connection to me. He was a major in the 24th Victoria Rifles of Canada Battalion. So behind me, in this trench, in this photo, this long trench behind me is just north of the town of Courcelette. Courcelette would be down kind of by my shoulder here. That's Regina Trench, and that is part of the battle we're going to talk about. It also was the longest trench on the Western Front in the First World War. On the first screen, you're also going to see a picture. This is the 21st Battalion storming the sugar factory. We're going to talk about that in the battle. It's a Canadian war painting you can see in the Canadian War Museum. And it depicts as accurately as war painters of the First World War did part of the action in the battle at just north or south of the village of Courcelette. So Military Family Services is not affiliated with any of the companies or things I'm going to mention, apps or products named in this presentation, and it's not sponsored by any of them. So that's really important. They don't sponsor me. They have asked me to present these battles because I happen to be a battlefield guide and Canadian. And so that's just really important to remember. So outline, we're going to talk a little bit of an overview, some recommended preparations, travel advisories, some helpful hints and tips, very important, especially on First World War battlefields. Some must-try food and treats and locations, some places to stay and transportation. And then we're going to talk about the Battle of the Somme leading from the 1st of July when it opened till the 3rd of September when the Canadian Corps moved into the battle. And then we're actually going to talk about the Battle of Courcelette on the 15th of September, which is kind of the main critical day. And then we're going to talk about the rest of the battle from the 16th to the 22nd of September 1916. Then we're going to talk quickly about the rest of the Battle of the Somme because it's all tied together and some things that are really worth a mention. So a point of interest, this tank photo here is a Mark I. The Battle of Courcelette happens to be the first time in history tanks are used in action. It was knocked out on the 15th of September. It's part of the Canadian attack. You'll notice that there's two field burials in this photo. It's from the Imperial War Museum. Those men were later recovered to either Attaqué or Courcelette Cemetery because those were the two battlefield cemeteries that most of the units were cleared to. So we're talking about France, and we're talking about the Somme and the Pas de Calais. What's unique about this battlefield is that the Somme and the Pas de Calais border happens to be the road just outside the village of Courcelette. And so the last little bit of the Battle of the Somme actually happens in the Pas de Calais. Its population as of January of 2020 was about 568,000. Of course, the main language is French. The closest international airport is Paris Charles de Gaulle. You can use Brussels, but it's a little bit less convenient sometimes because there is actually a really easy train service into Arras to get to this area. The Somme is largely a farming area in northern France, and it has several major rivers, including the River Somme, which the campaign gets its name from. It was devastated. This whole area was completely dead after the 141 long day battle in 1916, and it was fought over again in two separate battles in 1918, the first and second battles of the Somme, 1918. The cost of living in France is the 10th most expensive country in Europe. So it's kind of higher than the average for prices. Some cool facts about this region. Amiens has the largest Catholic cathedral in France, and that's at far end of the Somme. And so that's important. It has 371 Commonwealth Wargrave Commission cemeteries over the entire region. It hosts the national memorials of Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United Kingdom. Plus, it also has the largest memorial to the missing, which happens to be the missing of the Battle of the Somme, at the village of Thiepval. So the Somme is generally a mild climate with wet, cool winters, lots of rain, and warm, dry summers. It's actually quite pleasant to visit there. The best time to travel really is the end of April till about the middle of November. After that, it starts to get really wet and muddy, and things are closing up. Unfortunately, a lot of the big tourist stuff happens, kind of ends around the 11th of November, which does make sense. A rain jacket is always a good idea when it comes to clothing, and you need it for windbreaking because it does get windy on the Somme. And you want good footwear for walking. A lot of the places you're going to go to visit You're going to be walking down old farm roads. You're going to be on trails. There might be some cobblestone, but it's some pretty rugged areas kind of out of the way. Every memorial and cemetery are child friendly. Most places are child friendly. It's pretty good for France. And there's no city passes in the area because really Albert is kind of a small place. So travel advisories, and this is always important. Double check the Government of Canada website on travel advice for France. All the restrictions for COVID have been lifted except for those coming from China still. There's no visa or entry requirements for Canadians coming from Canada or from the EU countries, but there is a maximum 90-day stay in France if you're coming from Canada. So some security considerations. Petty crime is always a risk, but generally the Somme is a really safe area. It's kind of like small town France. There's medical care. Both Albert at one end of the battle and Bapaume at the other. They both have hospitals. 112, of course, is your emergency number in France, and the closest embassy or consulate happens to be Paris, which is the only one in France. So always dress for the weather. It's close to the sea, so it can be chilly. People don't quite realize how close it is to the sea, but you are actually quite close. The Somme region itself does have a chunk of the coast, and you never know. I've been there when it's been 36 degrees, and I've been there when they called for a nice warm sunny day and we got cold and wet. So always dress for the weather. It's pretty important, especially when you're walking around on some of the locations. Most of the locations, they're pretty isolated. Please do not climb on any monuments. They are exactly that. They're monuments, and some have ashes spread around them. These are pretty sacred places, not only to Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, people from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, anywhere else in the Commonwealth. But it's also really important to the French. They really, really hold these things sacred. They really appreciate what was done for them in their country. So it's important. Plus, if they have ashes spread around them, that's considered a gravesite. So it's just something to be considerate of. If you see vehicles, don't climb on those. Those can be in really decrepit shape because they've been outside for the better part of a century. So remember, you're visiting somebody's home. This is where they live and work. And to allow us to keep visiting, you need to respect their property and the memorials. One big thing is don't go walking through the fields. There's some safety considerations, but that's their livelihood, and we don't want to destroy the crops. I appreciate everybody wants to go find war remains because there's lots of them. Trust me, I found lots, but it's always on the roads or on the very verges of the trails, not in the farmers' fields. They really don't like that. So this picture here is pretty important. You can see my shadow in the photo taking it. That would be the third piece of artillery I'd parked beside that day. While the area was really heavily cleaned up after the First World War, there are still tons of unexploded ordnance that do litter these fields all the time. Don't touch any, stay away from it. And if you do see it, you have to realize that these are becoming more unstable over time, and they don't know if they're going to detonate. The French farmers just push them out of the way. Rough statistic, about 500 farmers since 1918 have lost their lives in the fields of the Somme. Because 1/3 of every artillery shell fired before 1917 by all combatants failed to explode. So there's a lot of unexploded ordnance. This is a fairly small shell. It's a British 18-pounder that is on a German trench line just outside the village of Courcelette. And I was literally about to pull in with a tour, and I had made comment of this, that you had to be careful. And they said, oh, like that thing right there. And I pulled away because I didn't want them trying to get out. And yeah, it can get very dangerous. Always have good footwear, as I always reiterate. Some sites, I said, have stone paths, but most are grass and are quite muddy. And it just makes it better. Flip-flops or sandals or running shoes are not good choices for seeing the Somme battlefield. So some must-try foods and treats. So le fincelle Picard is yummy. It's like a crepe stuffed with cheese and ham. So delicious. I've actually never had the cheese in the bottom. I've never found it, but I think it might be in a different part of the Somme. But if you're going to the Somme battlefield, and especially the Courcelette battlefield, or if you're at Beaumont-Hamel, you need to go to visit Le Tommy and Pozières. Now, it does not have the greatest food in the world. It does have great coffee, does have good beer, has a pretty good wine selection, but it has an amazing museum. It's actually on the battlefield. The Canadians attacked from just not far from this location. And he's got an amazing collection, including a chest from an ammunition crate from a Canadian artillery battery that was made in Ottawa, which is like super cool because that's my hometown. He's got a museum in the back. He's got great service. As I said, it's not rock star food. It's French pub food, but as a location, it's one of those must-visit locations because it's just so many artifacts that he's found on the battlefield. So best places to stay. There's two that I recommend. The Ibis Albert Pays de Somme, great little hotel. It's at the start line of the initial Battle of the Somme. Albert's got lots of services. It's a reasonable price. We use that as the members of the Guild of Battlefield Guide when we do our Somme recce's and professional development. And so it's a nice hotel, and I would recommend it. The other place to stay is number 56 Bed and Breakfast at La Boisselle. Now, it's fairly small. They have amazing food, amazing wine. The hosts are British. It's actually on the battlefield. La Boisselle was not far from Victoria Cross section. And it's just this quaint little village with this awesome little compound farm they had. They turned into a B&B. It's beautiful. Highly, highly recommended. If you want a great place to stay and it's just a couple of you going, that's where I'd recommend. So there's a mistake on this one. There is no rideshare services in Albert or on the Somme. It's pretty isolated. Tour guides. There's lots of tour guides you can use. I always recommend the Guild of Battlefield Guides, where you can contact me at Woolsey's War Walks, and a guide will give you context and take you to the locations. You always talk to them, tell them what you want to see. They may have just canned tours, or they might be like me, and I can customize things to Canadians because I know the Canadian side so well. When you're traveling, always have an international driver's license. It's a requirement for most countries to rent a car if you're renting a vehicle. And for the Somme, you kind of need a vehicle to drive around because it's literally in the middle of nowhere. So here's the fun part. We're going to talk about the Battle of the Somme. So the Battle of the Somme started on the 1st of July, 1916. It was fought by the British and the French with a total of 18 divisions between the two on a 24-kilometer wide front along both sides of the River Somme. Now, it was planned as this massive and grand offensive, but it failed to achieve its main goal, but it did accomplish many of its minor objectives. In fact, the Somme battle started so disastrously in the northern sector, especially around Beaumont-Hamel, with 20,000 men killed and 40,000 wounded in the first day alone. It was the bloodiest day of the British Army in history. No Canadians fought there. It was only the Newfoundlanders, and they were the only Dominion troops that fought on the first day of the Somme. The progress in this battle was agonizingly slow, and the casualties were very high. The objective was to attack actually into the German first and second defensive positions from Serre, south of the Albert-Bapaume Road, and the first position from the south at Frocourt. The 1st of July, so it was a huge disaster. And all these casualties happened before 11 a.m. That's what makes it from 7:30 in the morning till 11 a.m. They suffered 60,000 casualties almost. So the battle is broken down into a couple of phases. The first phase was the opening day of the Somme, and then the Battle of Albert, the 1st to the 13th of July, 1916, which is basically the road that Pozières is on and Courcelette. Albert's at one end and Bapaume's at the other. It's the big gray road in the middle, and it roughly splits the battlefield in half. Then they fought the Battle of the Byzantine Ridge from the 14th to the 16th of July, and then the Battle of Fromelles from the 19th to the 20th. The next phase is the second real phase, starts in July, which is the Battle of Deville Wood, the Battle of Pozières, the Battle of Guillemont, and the Battle of Ginchy. And those are kind of the opening phases. So now, the Canadian Corps was not at all involved in any of the fighting from the 1st of July until the 3rd of September. And in fact, the casualties were so high, by August, it had suffered the British Expeditionary Force, so Australians, Canadians, everybody that had fought on the Somme, had lost 200,000 men as casualties, which is about half the casualties suffered in the battle. Now, the Canadian Corps was moved to the Somme after what had been a terribly difficult spring and summer in the Ypres salient. They had arrived in Ypres salient in the fall of 1915, and by August of 1915, they were finally pulled out. They fought a terrible action at St. Eloi Craters. It was a complete debacle for the 2nd Canadian Division in its first fight. And then they had this incredibly tough and brutal fight at Mont-Sorel-en-Houge, which they suffered unbelievably high casualties for no gains or no loss of territory. The commander of the Canadian Corps at this point in the war is now Lieutenant General Julian Byng. The 1st Canadian Division is commanded by Major General Arthur Currie. The 2nd Canadian Division is commanded by Major General Richard Turner, VC. He won his Victoria Cross in the Boer War. And the 3rd Canadian Division is now under the command of a man named Major General Louis Lipset. And he's actually a British officer, but he had been seconded to the Canadians before the war. And that's all that makes up the Canadian Corps. There is a 4th Canadian Division. At this point in time, it's still training and being formed. It's under the command of Major General David Watson, and we're going to see it later in this battle. After arriving on the Somme, before I get there, the other important part of this change was that for the first time, the Canadians were going into action without the Ross rifle. Before this, most of the Canadian troops were armed with the Ross rifle, but in August of 1916, the Ross rifle was replaced by General Field Marshal Douglas Haig, and every Canadian now was issued with the Lee Enfield rifle, which was going to help solve part of the problems that Canada had suffered in the Ypres salient in the first year of the war. Arriving on the Somme on the 30th of August, the Canadian Corps relieved the 1st Australian and New Zealand Corps at the village of Pozières. The plan from the Commander-in-Chief of the Expeditionary Force, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, was for a renewed attack in the middle of September. The 2nd and 3rd Canadian Divisions were assigned to the attack, and while they prepared for their parts of the battle, the 1st Canadian Division held the 3,000-meter frontage the Canadian Corps had to hold, which ran west along the Pozières Ridge to a point about 700 meters west of a strong-pointed farm called Moncay Farm, and the Germans had heavily fortified this. The 1st Division time in the front line was filled with attacks and counterattacks, trying to finish off securing the front line from the Australians who were unable to capture, as well as trying to capture part of a German trench line called Faybeck-Graven. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade, for example, suffered 970 casualties in its tour at the front line from the 5th to the 8th of September. Now, there's 2 new innovations in this battle that we need to talk about. First one is the relatively newly introduced creeping barrage. So it was discussed, it was conceptualized, it had been tried, but it wasn't really used because of ammunition shortages in the British Army. Again, total war, it's a big step up. And it took until the Somme to have it actually become commonly used. They'd used hurricane bombardments, they'd used no bombardments, they'd used like targeted bombardment of various box barrages. But this was the first time where it was going to actually be a creeping barrage, where the infantry was going to walk behind about 50 to 80 yards behind artillery rounds falling down so they could advance and then be on top of the Germans before they could recover. The Battle of Courcelette, because Courcelette was only one half of this battle, Fleurs, the farther southern section, was a British-New Zealand battle, was also the first action for the tank. It was going to be also the first time that limited objectives were going to be used instead of making this big, massive grand offensive. Henry Rawlinson, the commander of the British Fourth Army, had convinced Field Marshal Haig not to do these massive, we're going to attack and reach 24 kilometers in a single day. He started using kind of bite and hold tactics. Him and a general named Plumer were very big on that. And General Rawlinson commanded all the troops south of the Albert-Bapaume Road. North of the Albert-Bapaume Road was under what's later was named the Fifth Army. Was under a man named Herbert Goff, whose reputation in the British Army was poor because he was young, aggressive, and he killed more soldiers than any other British general in the war. So, now to get to the fun part. The Battle of Courcelette. So, the 2nd Canadian Division and the 3rd Canadian Division are going to be the 2 major forces. This is the fact from the official history, and there's a little corner box, and that's showing you where the actual tanks, the broken down tank in the earlier photo is the one broken down just before the windmill. In the top corner of the little windmill is that little X thing in the white corner. So, the Battle of Courcelette, as it was actually called, was a 2-army attack made on about a 10-mile or 16-kilometer wide part of the battlefield. Fleurs and Courcelette as villages are only about 4.5, 5 kilometers apart. The Canadian Corps was on the very right-hand side and the very right edge of the 5th Army under Herbert Goff, as I said, and the attack was going to commence on the 15th of September 1916, with the 2nd Canadian Division attacking with its 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Rob Rennie, advancing astride the Albert-Bapaume Road, using the 18th and 20th Battalions on the right-hand side of the road and the 21st Battalion on the left. The 18th and 20th Battalions were to capture something called Candy Trench. So, of course, there's a sugar factory involved. So all of the names of the German trenches or their objectives were named after sweets for some reason. So the 21st Battalion, and Candy Trench is roughly where the memorial is today. You can, I've got it actually on the next map I'm going to show you. The 21st Battalion was to capture the sugar factory, which was a actual sugar factory. They converted sugar beets into sugar, and there was quite a few of them in the First World War around villages, and they were heavily fortified. And they were also supposed to capture parts of the Candy Trench on their side of the road. The 18th Battalion, sorry, before I get there, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division attacked with the 8th Brigade. Their job was to attack towards the Zolaran Trench and actually capture Moncay Farm and raid it. The other attack from the 2nd Canadian Division was from the 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade, and that was fought by the 27th and 28th Battalions. And their job was literally to move up, clear the Sugar Trench, and get ready to hold those lines and square it off so they could do their next attack. So this is actually a much better description of the battle. This is a First World War trench map. Please notice as you're looking at the map, you will see obliterated by a whole bunch of things. This is a February of 1917 trench map. I have the software that allows me to superimpose where we are on the battlefield when I'm touring. So I took this map and then I labeled where the Canadians were fighting and who they were. The neat thing about this battle is this is the first time the Canadians are wearing their colored patches. So 1st Canadian Division is a red patch, the 2nd Canadian Division is blue, the 3rd Canadian Division was originally black, and they realized that black wasn't able to be seen very well, so they changed it to gray. And then the second symbol, which was either a square, triangle, circle, semicircle, triangle, or square, denoted which battalion you were in that brigade, and then the color determined which brigade you were in that division. It seems complicated. There's a whole chart. If you need it, let me know. I can show it to you. It does get a little bit complicated with First World War Canadian markings. So this is the actual battlefield itself, and this is a majority of the attack. So the 18th Battalion advanced 1,200 yards, taking the German 1st and 2nd lines and holding them at a cost of 94 men killed and many, many more wounded. They were able to make contact with the 15th Scottish Division on the right-hand side of the Canadian Corps. In fact, the Canadians' 18th Battalion was withdrawn the very next day and was out of the line for 2 weeks as a clear indication of how intense and tough the fighting was for the battalion. They got hit really hard in their fight, but they took their objective in about 15 minutes. They hit from the start line to their first objective in about 15 minutes, which was the better part of that 1,000 yards. It was about a 1,000-yard advance. The 20th Battalion, to its immediate left of the 18th, in fact, had to fight off a German trench raid hours before their attack as they were getting ready to assemble. The Germans had decided that they wanted to do a trench raid. And so the 20th Battalion beat off the Germans, captured a whole bunch of them, and still made their timings and were on their first objective within 30 minutes of the battle starting. They made their advance on about a 250 yard wide front, and they penetrated about 1,000 yards from their start line. Their battalion scout officer, in fact, made it to the place called the Sunken Road, which is now the D-107. And there's actually a Canadian cemetery on that called Attaqué. And they found it lightly held. And actually just in front of that is actually where he got to. It was called Gun Pit Trench. And you cannot really see it on this map. And he actually entered there by about 8:05 in the morning. The unit was then attacked and then captured along with two, when the unit attacked, they captured the Gun Pit Trench entirely by 9:40 a.m. And they captured 2 officers, 50 men, a machine gun, and 3 trench mortars. Later that afternoon, they also beat off a German counterattack. The 21st Battalion attacked at 6:20 a.m. and experienced no difficulty as they moved and captured the German frontline trenches. They continued until they hit a serious resistance and fire from their left flank coming from the 6th Canadian Brigade's area. B Company of the 21st Battalion lost all of its officers, and its company sergeant major, a man named Dean, took command and led them into the sugar factory. The battalion surged onto the grounds, and by noon, they had completely captured it. Some Germans surrendered, while others had to be killed off. They continued to push forward until they reached the Sunken Road, the D-107, and their final objective, and they held on there. And they only made it that far with 200 men and 4 officers. The battalion went into the attack with almost 750 men. To its immediate left was the 6th Canadian Brigade under Brigadier Ketchen. The attack on the left towards the village of Courcelette and a final section of Candy Trench, which was perpendicular, and the perpendicular Sugar Trench, which was parallel to the farm roads, with their 27th and 28th battalions. The 27th went into the attack, and right away they faced heavy fire but once they got to the German first position, they overcame the defenders and they had it completely taken in about 10 minutes. At this point, their entire first wave had been killed or wounded, and the second wave had leapfrogged forward through them. A company had reached its next objective under the command of a corporal, with about 15 men in total making it to the objective. A patrol from the follow-on and supporting battalion, the 31st, who followed up, went forward and reached the outskirts of the Courcelette village, but were forced back by enemy fire to the 27th line. On the 15th of September, the 27th Battalion lost 394 men as casualties, of which 72 were killed. The 28th Battalion, with support from the 31st Battalion as well, also attacked, and they had 2 tanks with them, which became stuck behind the Canadian front line, while one of them went forward. By 7:40, it was reported that the 28th were on their final objective, and by 8:15, they were beginning to consolidate. They too sent 2 platoons from the 31st Battalion through to the village and just got short of it, but were halted. They also had to put more troops forward to fill a gap that was discovered between 2 of the 2 units of the 6th Brigade. And they spent most of their day trying to consolidate their position, and they suffered 304 casualties on the day. Now, this was the end of the first phase of the battle, with the 4th and 6th Canadian Brigades sorting out their lines, setting up their defenses, and of course, repulsing German counterattacks, which was German doctrine. They would always throw a quick counterattack in. Immediately to the left, the 3rd Canadian Division under Louis Lipset attacked with the 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles under the command of Lieutenant Colonel D.C. Draper, who was later a brigade commander, to secure the left flank of the attack. And they captured the objective and set up a block in the Valley-Back-Graben trench line along the Grand Court Road, shooting down the Germans as they fled from the Canadians. Further left, the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles were tasked to perform 2 raids on the Germans. One was a feint, or a mock attack, against some suspected deep dugouts, and the other was to be against the fortified farm, Moncay Farm. They sent about 50 men into each raid. In the raid against the dugouts, they spent about 10 minutes doing about as much damage as they possibly could and returned to their lines until they got caught by German counter-bombardment, causing many casualties amongst the raiders. The raiding party on Moncay Farm got onto the position and started bombing entrances and dugouts. The secondary task was to string a series of shell holes into a more forward trench line, which they were also able to accomplish. They too had to hold off many counterattacks and suffer shelling, but in total they made it off lightly with only 90 killed and 170 wounded. The 5th CMR position was about 30 yards in front of the Canadian front line and began suffering casualties as they moved through their first objectives. They met little resistance as they discovered that the opening bombardment had made some of their objectives completely unusable by the Germans. And when they did come under fire, after digging in, sometime around midday, they created a trench block and covered it with machine guns and grenade bombing parties. At 11 o'clock that morning, the Canadian Corps ordered an attack on the village to begin with fresh troops at 6:15 that evening. The 22nd French Canadian Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel T.L. Tremblay and the 25th Nova Scotia Rifles under Lieutenant Colonel E. Hillam, later a brigade commander, of the 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade arrived at Sugar and Candy trenches and attacked into Courcelette when their supporting barrage lifted, quickly occupying a line around the village, cemetery, and quarry, which are on the far side of the D-107. The 2 battalions repulsed counterattacks for 3 days and nights. 800 men of the 22nd Battalion who went into the action, only 118 walked out of the battle. The 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade, under Brigadier A.C. MacDonnell, attacked from Sugar Trench with its 42nd and PPCLI and lost many casualties to machine gun fire and found it hard to keep direction on the shattered landscape, but captured MacDonnell Trench, which happens to be on the road where the Courcelette Cemetery is, and east end of the Valley-Back-Graben, which is a fairly long trench line. The 2 brigades linked with the 5th Canadian Brigade, except for a small gap of about 200 yards between 2 of the German trench lines, Valley-Back-Graben and Zollerngraben. The left of Valley-Back-Graben was captured easily and prisoners were taken. By 6:30 p.m., the 3rd Division also attacked with the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles, advancing through a barrage and captured more of the German forward trench lines, and formed a trench block. And by 8:15 p.m., the 49th Loyal Edmonton Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel W.A. Griesbaugh, advanced from support to pass through the PPCLI and the 42nd Battalion, and advanced to a line close to the Zollerngraben, but was prevented by difficult ground and heavy fire. 2 companies captured a chalk pit just short of their communication, or their German trench lines, and they dug a communication trench forward, and the rest of the line was fortified. So to give you some perspective, that's a German shell early in September 1916, bursting over Canadian positions. That's the battlefield just outside of Pozières, looking towards Courcelette. The photo beside it is the ruin of Montquet Farm. It was a very heavily fortified farm. The farm has been since rebuilt, but it was completely, it took from July till, it was a first day objective actually for the British, until September for it to be captured, and it was completely shattered. The other one is Canadian infantry in a reserve trench under shell fire. That is sometime around between the 15th and the 22nd of September 1916, according to the Imperial War Museum, is when that photo was taken. And the ruins of the sugar factory, as you can tell, the fighting was very, very fierce. The complete factory was destroyed. It was absolutely just a horrific fight. So this is some of what the battlefield looks like today. So the field that the 21st Eastern Ontario Battalion attacked across on September 15th, 1916 is right there. That is literally on the side of the D929, which is the road between Albert and Bapaume. It's the same road. It's an old Roman road. And that is me, stopped on the side of the road. That's smack dab in the middle of the advance. We're probably about 300 or 400 yards from the start line. As you can see, it's flat and it's open, and there's not a whole lot there. At the Canadian start line, actually just behind the Canadian start line, is the Tank Corps Memorial. And this is where one of the tanks actually got stuck at the beginning of the attack. If you look at the picture, it's actually opposite the Pozières windmill. And there's a tank that got stuck on the other, just on that hedge. There's a building behind it. Just on the other side of that is where one of the tanks got stuck. And the big 13-ton Quebec granite block, that is the Courcelette Memorial. The 22nd Battalion attacked from just west of here, from the memorial, into the village of Courcelette, which is on this photo to the right, with the 24th Victoria Rifles coming up in support. So I'm going to talk quickly about the 24th Victoria Rifles. While the 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade was attacking forward, the 24th was on loan from the 5th Canadian Brigade, and they had one rifle company holding the entire front line at Pozières. And then they had two companies acting and carrying in support parties all day. And then when the attack was ordered by the 5th Canadian Brigade and their units moved up for the attack, the 24th went in support of that attack as well. So the two battalions that attacked, the 22nd and the 25th, attacked into the village of Courcelette. The 26th was the mopping up force behind them, also suffered quite heavily, and the 24th was behind them. So it's quite the fight. So this is the village, this is the ruins of the Pozières windmill, which is opposite and is the Canadian start line of location. And as you can tell by the two photos, it was never rebuilt. But again, it was heavily, heavily destroyed. The other photo is actually a view from the Canadian start line down the Albert-Bapaume Road, the line of advance of the 4th Brigade. So just this is just taken from just behind the Canadian start line. From the 15th, it's actually really well signed where the start line was each month. And so on the left-hand side of that road is where the 21st Battalion went in, and on the right-hand side of that road is where the 20th Battalion attacked from. And you can see on there, that's actually taken from the parking area for the tank memorial. And you can see those trees in the distance. That's the sugar factory, or roughly where the sugar factory is going to be. And the sugar factory today is a chateau and a farm. So they rebuilt the area after. They did not rebuild it as a sugar factory. It's private property. You can't go into it. They don't really want you going near it. They're not very friendly to visitors. But that's the sugar factory. And roughly where in that property off onto the right-hand side, there's actually a big underground dugout. And that is where the headquarters of the 24th Battalion moved to. My great-grandfather was in that compound because he was in battalion headquarters in this fight. So the Courcelette Memorial is the Canadian War Memorial that commemorates the Canadian Corps actions in the final 2.5 months of the Somme offensive on the First World War. The Canadians participated on the Somme from the 15th of September to the 18th of November, and the British engaged with the British engaging in several battles within the Battle of the Somme, included the actions of Flers Courcelette, Thiepval Ridge, Ancre Heights, and the Ancre. This is quite a serious fight. So one thing I forgot to mention was that the attack was going to carry on. And it's interesting because it didn't just stop. On the 16th to the 22nd is the rest of the battle. The 2nd Canadian Division had a hold on for several more days, as well as putting attacks in against the further German defenses. The 22nd and 24th Battalions attacked what is now across what is now the D-107, then called the Sunken Road, on the 17th of September. You can see from this map is from the official history of the 24th Battalion, and you can see what their initial battalion objective was. My great-grandfather was in that attack, is on the position with the headquarters. And interestingly enough, D Company was almost wiped out to a man in that attack. The attack went forward, and they could not get through the German trench lines. The 22nd Battalion in these days, in the days from the 15th to the 22nd, suffered 336 casualties. The 24th Battalion, 340 casualties. The 25th Battalion, 258. And the 26th Battalion, a total of 337 casualties. The 2nd Division was then replaced by the 1st Canadian Division on the 18th of September, 1916. And they continued to fight off German attempts to retake Courcelette, and they ended up pushing another 500 yards east, taking more and more of the German positions. And in this week of fighting, the entire attack and all the units involved cost Canada 7,200 casualties. There was one Victoria Cross recipient in this battle, in fact. And on the 16th of September, at Courcelette, France, during a bombing attack, Private Kerr, John Shipman Kerr, 49th Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force, Royal Edmonton Regiment, was acting as a bayonet man, and noting that bombs were running short, bombs are a term for grenades, he ran along the parados, or the back end of the trench, backside of the trench, under heavy fire until he was in close contact with the enemy, when he opened fire at point-blank range with his rifle, inflicting heavy losses. The enemy, thinking that they were surrounded, surrendered. He took 62 prisoners and 250 yards of enemy trench. Earlier, in fact, in the day, Private Kerr actually had lost 2 fingers, but he did not have his wound dressed until he and 2 other men escorted all the prisoners back under fire and reported what had happened, which is an incredible act of bravery. And that's not far from the town of Courcelette itself. It's quite just west and north of it. So this is what Courcelette looked like at the end of the battle. It was completely smashed. You look at Courcelette today, and if you look at the bottoms of many of the houses, you'll notice that the top half seem really nice and new, and then you'll see some really old brickwork at the bottom. They actually rebuilt the town on the exact road plan that it had at the time. Really unique. You see that in some First World War locations, not always, but Courcelette was completely rebuilt. I have walked that with a First World War trench map only, and I knew exactly where I was at every location. There's only one building that I know of that was not. There was a chateau called the Red Chateau, and it was never rebuilt. So the rest of the Battle of the Somme, because the Battle of the Somme for Canada and for the entire Allied force still was fighting and still going on until November. Point of note, if you notice the colors I used in this, these are the 4 divisional patches, colors that the divisions used in the First World War. So October and November 1916, the Canadian Corps remained on the Somme until the 17th of October 1916. The 4th Canadian Division arrived on the 10th as part of the British 2nd Corps. The 4th Division only left the Somme and joined the Canadian Corps at Vimy at the end of November 1916. And the Somme offensive had cost Canada 24,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest battle in the First World War for Canada. It was incredible. So my great-grandfather with the 5th Canadian Brigade, 24th Battalion, fought at Courcelette. They were pulled out, refitted, reset, and then went back in 2 more times in the fight. My great-grandfather walked away without a scratch, which was remarkably impressive, because that was exceptionally rare. So the 3rd phase of the Battle of the Somme started with the Battle of Courcelette. We call it the Battle of Courcelette because that's all we care about as Canadians. The Battle of the Thiepval Ridge from the 26th to the 28th of September 1916. The Battle of the Ancre Heights from the 1st of October to the 11th of November 1916. And then the Battle of the Ancre itself. So where do we visit? Well, the top cemetery is just outside the village of Pozières. There's actually 2 of them. They're in a farmer's field, and they're unique for Canadians because one is actually a strictly Canadian cemetery, and the other is just across the way, and it actually contains a lot of Canadians. So they are Sunken Road and 2nd Canadian Cemetery, Sunken Road, and there's not very many Canadians in them. The 2nd Canadian Cemetery only contains 42 soldiers from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Battalion of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. They had for some reason, their own cemetery. It's uncommon. These guys all fell in the fighting leading up to the Battle of Courcelette. And you'll notice there's a brass flag on it. That is for cemeteries that are predominantly Canadian. Not everyone has it. This cemetery does, but the other side of the road, or shouldn't say road, the farm trail, is called Sunken Road Cemetery. There's about 147 Canadians in there, including a 16-year-old and a 52-year-old, both from different battalions, as well as a major with a Distinguished Service Order, which wasn't very common, and a company sergeant major with the Distinguished Conduct Medal, which is the second highest medals for bravery for officers and NCOs. You have to park, you can drive when it's dry up to it down the farm road, a little bit challenging, but it's not for small cars or low cars. But you can actually park on the side of the road and walk in. It's about 300 meters into the cemetery, and it's worth visiting them. They're really quiet. They're my wife's favorites. We discovered them when we were driving around the Somme on our first visit. And it was one of the places that drew me to the Somme and made me want to guide there more because I wanted to know more about these men. One of the other cemeteries that's important to see, of course, is Attaqué Cemetery. So Attaqué Cemetery is Canada spelled backwards. It has a Canadian Victoria Cross recipient from the battle, James Richardson. He was a piper with the 16th Canadian Infantry Battalion, the Canadian Scottish. He won it in October, 8th of October, playing his bagpipes in front of the German barbed wire as his battalion was storming the German trenches. And he then was carrying off wounded and went to go retrieve his bagpipes and was not found until 1922. His bagpipes were only returned to Canada quite recently because a British officer had found them, thought it was a weird tartan, and put him in his unit museum, and nobody thought that that was anything of that. The other cemetery to see, and there's 2 soldiers from the 24th Battalion, which means they only had something to identify them as such. That is Courcelette British Cemetery. There's a lot of Canadians in there. I always think it's a good idea to visit it. It's actually on the attack. It's where the PPCLI it's almost at the PPCLI objective on the 15th of September. There's 2 Canadian 16-year-olds in there. One of them is George Ritchie. He's a member of the Royal Canadian Regiment. He lied about his age. He got onto the battlefield. He arrived in France in August of 1916, and he was going into his very first attack on the 16th of September, 1916, and he was listed as missing in action and was found 30 days later on the battlefield. So it's very moving. There's about 2,200 people, soldiers in that cemetery. A majority of them are Canadian. There's no fence around it, and it's literally like Attaqué, smack dab in the middle of the battlefield. And so you can go there and see a great deal. And unfortunately, I've almost parked on more unexploded ordnance at Courcelette Cemetery than I should probably admit. So, and at Courcelette Cemetery, there are actually guys that were buried there originally in the war, which is kind of unique. The other neat thing about Courcelette Cemetery is that of the men in there, 1,180 are unidentified. So that kind of tells you how tough it was. I don't have a photo of it. It's called Regina Trench Cemetery. It was a German trench captured by the 5th Canadian Brigade for the first time in 1st of October 1916. My great-grandfather's battalion, and he fought there. And then it was attacked again by the 1st and 3rd Divisions on the 8th of October. And that is when Richardson was VC. And it was taken in part by the 4th British Division on the 21st of October, and finally captured incomplete on the 11th of November 1916. Kind of fitting. The original part of the cemetery is now what we call Plot 2 and rows A and D. There's some mass graves and such in there. And it was completed after the armistice. Many graves were placed up from the entire battlefield, and there was many from around Courcelette, Grand Court, and Miramont. Most of the soldiers fell, of course, in the October-November timeframe. That cemetery at Regina Trench, it's down a farm road, but it's totally worth seeing because you actually realize that the German trench line was on the reverse slope, and you can actually are standing when you're in the cemetery and on that road, you are actually on the German trench. You would never know it from looking at the ground today, but you are actually 100% on that trench line. There are 2,200 men in Regina Trench. Of those, 1,077 are unidentified, but there are special memorials to 14 believed to be buried in that cemetery. And uniquely, there's an American airman who is attached to the Royal Flying Corps. So he has a very unique headstone in there, and it's always neat to see that. So Adanac, and I forgot to mention this about Adanac, has 3,100 Commonwealth burials in it, of which 1,700 are unidentified. And as I said, there is a Victoria Cross recipient there as well. So that is in that little space. And those cemeteries that I just talked to you about are 1,500 Canadian known fallen from the Battle of the Somme. That's not the unknowns. Those are just named. They can tell you who they are on their headstone. It's actually, and that's all in a space of less than 5 kilometers. So this is how tight and compact and intense this fighting was. It was a really tough battle. So this is one of my favorite things. This photo on the left-hand side is one of the most famous photos of the First World War. It's taken on September 15th near Courcelette. It's believed to be 5th Canadian Infantry Brigade guys. In fact, somebody claims that one of the men is from the 25th Battalion itself. It's a little bit hard to tell. It's of Canadian wounded and medics in the trench. Now, if you look at the photo on the left, there's a man, and he's looking up at the camera. His helmet's kind of cocked, twisted, and he's got this kind of half crazy smile. And most people crop it down to his face and his eyes, and he's got this crazy looking smile on his face. Well, it's taken out of context. If you look at the photo on the right-hand side, you'll see that it's the same guy in the trench, and he's being bandaged. And you can see he's in a great deal of pain. So he actually isn't shell-shocked. He's looking up the camera and smiling. He's happy to be alive and only lightly wounded. At one point, he was identified as a Nova Scotian man who died later and is on Vimy Ridge Memorial. It's not confirmed. The faces look the same, but the wounds don't match up. The man in question was shot in the neck, and this man is clearly injured in the hand. You'll also notice something unique about him. It looks like he's blown out his knees of his pants. In fact, he's actually wearing shorts. So sometimes British and Canadian soldiers will wear shorts in the hot months, and some are wearing pants. But those are 2 photos taken by the same photographer. All the things you can see in the background, it's 100% the same people in the same space. And so that's one of the great myths, is that everybody calls that the shell-shock soldier. In fact, he's just happy to be alive. And I would be too, after fighting in that fight. And thank you very much. That is the Battle of Courcelette.